Good evening and welcome to this month's Whiskey Me live tasting. It's April of 2023. Wow, already. And this month we are graced with two fantastic drams. This might be my favorite month ever, at least since we started doing World Whiskey for Whiskey Me, because we've got one of the best whiskies, full stop, in Scotland, as far as I'm concerned, to taste in the form of Glenfarclas 15. I'm not trying to put words in anyone's mouth here, but it is a fantastic whiskey. And then we've got one of my favorite New World European whiskies as well, which is Stauning Rye from Denmark. And well, as we'll see when we come to taste it in a second, it's just a fantastic rye whiskey. And I think I'm really looking forward to hear what you guys think about it too. So without further ado, we're going to start, as always, with our Scotch single malt whiskey. And to help me along the journey on that one with Glenfarclas is a return guest, Tim Webster. Hey, Tim.
Hello, good evening. Lovely to be back.
So we were just saying, we did Glenfarclas 25. All the new Whiskey Me members, anyone who's not been around for sort of 2 years plus, are like, what? They said out Glenfarclas 25. We did it a couple of years ago, didn't we?
Yes, yeah, I think that was, we were quite proud to be the oldest whiskey there. And I think we did the 105 earlier to that as well, and so now to do the 15, I think we're going along well, but it has been, and also quite a few years spread out, so it's quite fun.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you're right. I forgot we did 105 too. So I think there's only two distilleries in Scotland we've done 3 times. And one of them is Glenfarclas and the other one is Glasgow, I think. I don't think there's any others we've done 3 times.
Amazing. Well, it's a pleasure to be involved, as always. Good to be back.
Yeah, well, honestly, if I was going to pick a distillery to do 3 times, Glenfarclas would definitely be up there in the running, because I think one of the things about this whiskey, obviously we'll get into a little bit of the history stuff and production and everything, but I would say, go back and look at the past videos as well if you want to. Each one's going to give you little tidbits that perhaps we don't cover tonight, and you get the full picture across all 3 of them maybe. But what I would say about Glenfarclas is that every expression just hits the nail on the head. None of them miss a beat. Even the younger ones, there's something special there that isn't there in the 15 or in the older expressions.
Absolutely. I mean, I was doing a tasting last night in person in a whiskey bar, and tasting through the whole series is something I would always recommend for any whiskey distillery. But with Glenfarclas especially, as you say, we've got some really amazing older whiskies in the core range, but some of the 10, and then we've had the 12-year-old for the last few years in the range as well, are unbelievably good for a variety of reasons. But if we're going to talk about production, the youthful Glenfarclas is actually more interesting sometimes. But the 15-year-old we have tonight is very characteristically sort of Glenfarclas, classic Glenfarclas.
I think so as well. I mean, it sits somewhere in the middle of the age range there, doesn't it? Anyway, we are kind of getting ahead of ourselves, and it's totally my fault. So maybe Tim, do you want to just give us a kind of brief overview of the distillery's history, and the family-run element of it and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So Glenfarclas means Valley of the Green Grass. It's situated right in the heart Speyside, right at the foot of Ben Rinnes. It does say Highland single malt whiskey on the label, but that's just because it's been around for a lot longer than the region, or sort of say Speyside. Yeah. That name's been around. It's been around since legally distilling since 1836. So we celebrated 185 years the other day with this anniversary bottling, which it was fantastic and very interesting. But we've got an image of the distillery from distilling in 1790. So the distillery's been around for a lot longer, but I think a lot of distilleries could say that. They've been around illicitly distilling, and then when it became financially viable to do so, started legal distilling. But in 1865 is when it really kicked off for Glenfarclas and family ownership. It was bought by a farmer called John Grant, who sort of needed it as a halfway point between herding cattle up and down the Spey to the market at Elgin. And from there, John Grant went to George Grant, and then John Grant is our current chairman. So there's a lot of Johns and Georges kicking about there. And very much something that really defines Glenfarclas is that family ownership, and it's been able to allow it to do some really long-term planning, thinking, designing, and that's formed the way the whiskey tastes. Everything is around sort of the flavor, the juice, all the decision making. Because if you're making it for a family business, it's such long term the thinking. It's not about making quick money fast, and that's shown in the way we direct fire our stills, dunnage warehousing. Very fortunate to have all of it matured on site in quite a unique setting with lots of water. And as in 1988, it stopped being a full-time farm, or farming half distillery, half farm. But at that time, they had the second oldest herd of Aberdeen Angus cattle in the UK, which is quite a fun fact, which I quite like, to show that whiskey popularity did drag them into the proper full distillery.
That was only in 1988, did you say?
Yeah, 1988.
Wow, that's incredible. That's cool.
Where there was a lot of change in the industry.
Yeah. So you threw out a few things there, like direct fired stills, dunnage warehouse. Obviously, there's a heavy use of sherry cask there as well.
Yeah.
How and in what way do all of these factors play? Because they are, like you say, quite a traditional approach to doing things. How do they factor into flavour? What does that change? How does that change what comes in the bottle?
So sherry casks would be the big one, especially with this expression of Glenfarclas. We've been using since around 1988, another date again, when sherry had to be bottled in sherry. We've been using the same sherry bodega, another family run. John Grant, the current chairman, went out there and basically got made to order casks to come over, and we use exclusively European oak, which as opposed to American oak, as opposed to giving you sort of vanilla and coconut, gives you a lot more sort of cloves and spices, which means when you get to the 25, but yes, and there's 15 that we're about to try, lots of Christmas cake and richness and spiciness. And that's they're not cheap types of casks. Your American oak grows faster, easier to harvest. You can use more of the tree. And there's lots of reasons why that would be an easier and cheaper choice. But for the basis of flavor, Glenfarclas has always sort of been with that European oak and Oloroso sherry. So this will be all Oloroso sherry. And then they use the casks 4 times. And majority, 60%, will always be first and second fill, and then third and fourth. But it's sort of like a cask recipe. So that's how we create different flavors and styles within the Glenfarclas range that only use one type of cask. And then the direct firing is fairly unique in the industry. I think we're the only people left who do it 100%. There are certain people, I think Glenfiddich do it 13 out of the something stills, and a few other people do it only with their wash still. I think the Macallan were the last people in 2010 to do it 100% wash and spirit still. But what that means is just it heats it at a much higher temperature as opposed to the steam coils. So when you're heating about 350 degrees C as opposed to 350 degrees C, that 300 degree difference in temperature creates lots of different amazing things, like the Maillard reaction, which basically is sort of caramelizing different things that have gotten into the still. And we have the largest stills in Speyside, so you're going to get a bigger, different flavor. You get basically a heavier new make, possibly richer. There's lots of sort of green apples, grassiness, digested biscuits, and you need a big, heavy new make. New make is the spirit that obviously goes into the barrel when we fill it, and you need a big, aggressive, flavorful new make to be able to stand up to the big, amazing sherry flavors, which will come to dominate it over time. So it would be cheaper to go steam coils, gas bills, and everything since we last.
It was done briefly, wasn't it, and then changed back.
It was done, I think, in '82. It was done for about 3 weeks, and then they sent the whiskey away for analysis, and they said, "Oh, what's going on here?" And the analysis came back. Obviously, yes, this is whiskey. It's great, but it's nothing like Glenfarclas. It's not in any way comparable to what you were making. And I think that big change, and perhaps the thought that it would lack the robustness needed to stand up to the sherry casks, meant that they literally tore that new still out and went back to direct fired stills, which is quite, and that's something you can, yes, we were talking about family ownership. That's the less efficient, more indirect way of making whiskey, but something that was done purely for the flavor.
Yeah. The interesting thing that I find about whiskies that have had full term in sherry casks like this, and there's a few others, Highland Park and Macallan are pretty much just sherry casks. I think there's some American knocking about there like bourbon casks, but mostly sherry. Is that there often don't seem to be as sherried as certain whiskies that are finished in sherry cask. We're kind of, everyone's familiar with this term sherry bomb now, where you get a whiskey that more or less just tastes like high strength sherry. And it becomes quite kind of, insipid in a way, like and not particularly pleasant to drink when it's sort of overly sherried and heavy. But it doesn't, in my experience, this doesn't seem to happen. You'd think it would be even worse when a whiskey spent 15, 20 years in a sherry cask, but there's some kind of cask magic at play here where actually it sort of seems to harmonize and dulls that kind of sherry characteristic, not to a detriment, but it sort of tames it somewhat. Do you agree with what I'm saying there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think from thinking about the way they go about making it at Glenfarclas, they I think in the 50s they decided that Oloroso was the best way of doing it, and then or what they wanted to do, and then I think the rest of the industry, you see Oloroso sherry as the main one. I think it's when you come to the vatting, us using the quite thick, very well made. Our casks take 2 years to the staves to dry in Jerez, and then 4 years. Might have got that wrong. Might be the other way around. 4 years. No, yeah. 4 years to age the sherry, 2 years to dry the staves. And then by the time it gets to us, it's 6 years old, slightly thicker as well. Sort of traditional export sort of thickness of barrel. And then we use it 4 times. And you think, as the tea bag analogy often gets used when you say, how active are these casks? And when you have a mix of those casks, you can make pretty much any style you like, and a mix of sizes as well, hogsheads and sherry butts, which obviously have different wood to liquid ratio. I think in the vatting process, when they come to make the whiskies, that's how they avoid doing something like that. And
I mean, if you're just taking if you're taking a bourbon cask, say whiskey, and putting it into first fill sherry cask for 2 years, then it's going to taste quite strongly of sherry, right?
Yeah, and if you're doing
whereas if you're vatting, like you say, third, fourth fill, you know, along with first fill.
Yeah, balances a little bit, I think. I mean, you can make any style. Some of the most amazing Glenfarclases are the family cask range, the single casks, where you see some first fills from, say, the 80s or something like that, and it's sort of dark as coffee, and it's incredible. And when they've been chosen to be in that bottling, they're amazing to drink on their own. But you just think how, when you're using casks like that to make, say, a 40-year-old whiskey that Glenfarclas produced as a vatted bottling, there's a lot to work with, and there's a lot of flavors you may have to balance out.
Yeah, nice, cool. Well, I think people are tasting already. I certainly am. Let's have a tasting, and I'm going to just flash up a few comments and observations as we go. But if you want to maybe just tell us a little bit about the liquid, if you don't mind.
Yep. So 46%. I don't know if that says it on the sachet. 46%
legally has to.
yeah. Bottled in Scotland and with the ABV. So 15 years old at 46%. A lot of the rest of the range at 43. 46% was decided about 60 years ago by one of the George Grants that I've briefly mentioned earlier, just purely because that's what he thought a whiskey should be bottled at. And that was right at the beginning of sort of the new single malt craze in sort of the 60s, where Glenfarclas started bottling 15-year-old 105 and pure malt and things like that. This, to me, leans into the sort of, we briefly touched on it, there's a rich, it's a really good example of a good sherry cask whiskey. If you'd say what is one of the best sherry cask whiskies at a decent age, I would always, I'm paid to say it now, say Glenfarclas 50, and I think it's one of the best examples. It's not finish, it's matured exclusively in Oloroso sherry, and with that you get sort of just amazing length, definitely, which is something you get in our 25-year-old as well. It's had time to develop complexity, whereas the 10-year-old may not have, or is special for different reasons. But you get sort of, you're verging on the Christmas cake, which I sort of mentioned when I talked about the European oak, the dried fruit, definitely. Slightly toffeed butterscotch. Some people say candy floss, which I've taken to heart, and now that's all I sort of smell at the end of a 15-year-old.
It has got a certain kind of confectionery note to it. I just think it's kind of got a bit of everything, and that's what, you know, it's got some of that dried fruit sherry, but it's also got a youthful vibrancy to it as well. They're still fresh, you know, there's fresh fruit in there too. You get sort of toffee and caramel and butterscotch and those kind of barrel qualities too. And then the weight of it on the palate as well. The whole thing just kind of adds up. I mean, when we sent out the literature for this, the email for this. I wrote the email and I just said we think it's the best 15-year-old in Scotland. That's on sort of continual release, you know. No, yeah, 15-year-old whiskey.
My job's done. I'm out. Tristan is in.
Well, it is. I'm actually in a WhatsApp group, and we played a game about a year ago now, where we went from numbers. I think we went from 10 to 21, and the game was we had to decide which was the best 10-year-old whiskey, and we had a day to work that out. Then the next best 11-year-old. Obviously, certain numbers there aren't that many prime numbers. It tends to be best 12-year-old and so on. I'm pretty sure Glenfarclas 15 came out top in the 15-year-old category.
It does. A true test of a sort of a whiskey is, I always say, people fall in love with Glenfarclas after tasting it, and then if they haven't done that for some absurd reason, is hearing about the story and how it came to be and the choices that were made that led to it being in the bottle. I think you can't not sort of love. So, but it also does very well in a blind tasting, which I really enjoy, because if you line up in a blind tasting, when you take away the brand and stuff, it does very, very well, which I enjoy.
Yeah. Quick question here. Love the 17-year-old. Has it been discontinued? Don't think I've had that.
In the UK, that was a Gordon MacPhail exclusive till about 3 years ago. You sometimes find it in specialist retailers here in the UK who have grabbed it from other places, but it is in other markets, just not the UK market at the moment.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Good stuff. Well, look, if anyone wants to learn more about Glenfarclas, there's our blog post. There's also the previous videos we've done. Yeah, that should hopefully keep you satisfied. But I don't think it takes a genius to work out it's one of my favorite distilleries in Scotland anyway. Cool. Well, let's move on to Stauning now. I'm going to bring in co-founder of Stauning, Alex Munch. Hey, Alex.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for letting me be here.
No, pleasure. Thanks for joining us. And thanks for listening to Tim and I just get romantic about Glenfarclas there.
What a story. 185 years old. My
Amazing.
God. That's impressive.
It is. So Stauning, not quite so old, but making great waves in the industry. We've got a whiskey bar, myself and Tom, the co-founders of Whiskey Me. We've got a whiskey bar in London called Black Rock, and we've had Stauning in there for a few years now. And it's always been one of the most popular European whiskies that we stock. You seem to be killing it. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's nice to hear.
Yeah. So maybe you could start by telling us where it all started. How did it come about?
How long do we have? 3 hours or something like that?
There's some people on this tasting who I reckon would happily sit here for 3 hours and drink whiskey and listen to us talk.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll try to do it much shorter than that. Well, it started in 2005. One of my now good friends, Martin, heard a radio program about whiskey. And in that program, they said it's easy to make whiskey, but it's difficult to make a good whiskey. He was on his way to a summer house to meet up with the family and also some friends. And he met with the family and he told them at the summer house, well, I heard this radio program. They said it's easy to make whiskey. Nothing about it's difficult to make a good whiskey, but it's easy to make whiskey. They're like, oh, okay. They had never heard about whiskey in Denmark before. And there's a reason to that, of course. And they said to Martin, but Martin, we do not know anything about whiskey. So like literally nothing about whiskey besides drinking it. And he was like, yeah, no, but I thought about this. Let's call up some friends. There might be one of these friends that knows something about whiskey. And they created a list of, I think, 25 people. Luckily, I was one of the first people on that list. They started calling the friends. And I think after calling 7, 8 friends, everybody, of course, said, yes, let's try it out. So we met in Martin's house some months later, and Martin and Jesper and Lasse, 3 brothers, they had made a PowerPoint presentation about how to make whiskey. and if you were to take a look at that PowerPoint presentation today, you would laugh. It was like, well, grain, yeast, water, distillation, a cask, boom, you have whiskey. Like, So imagine 9, 10 friends or boys sitting there. Let's go for it. That sounds crazy easy. So we bought a set of pot stills. We started up in Martin's father's old butchery. So he had what you call a home butchery. So in the backyard, he was actually having a small butchery. So we would start up in that place because that was approved for making food, the butchery. You need a place that's approved for making food. And imagine, I'm sure you can picture whiskey made in a butchery. We had a big fridge where you would hang the meat. You could do floor malting in there. You could control the temperature. Right. We wanted to do everything from scratch because we actually didn't know anything about whiskey.
So we kind of assumed that everyone did floor malting as sort of part of the process. Yeah.
Well, actually, if you want to start doing something, the best way is kind of learning by doing it from scratch. So we kind of, I think this was in 2005. I can't remember if we had Google at that point of time, but we had Yahoo. So I guess we Yahooed how to make whiskey. And you get like 10 million hits on different recipes on making a whiskey. We chose the Scotch way of making whiskey, and we chose Ardbeg as a kind of a role model for making a whiskey. So a peat smoked single malt whiskey.
Yeah,
we have a lot of peat in Denmark also. So floor malting in the fridge. We could dry the grain in the oven where you would smoke meat. So kind of a smoked ham. We smoked the meat.
Oh yeah. I'm starting to see how a butchery can be turned into a distillery now. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. The meat grinder you could use for grinding grain, of course. Not easy, I tell you, but it can be done. And so everything was kind of in there, and we had bought a set of pot stills from Portugal. I think a 400 liter and a 600 liter, something like that. And then one long weekend after Mogens, the butcher, had made a beer. The beer we distilled, and it took like 2 days of distilling. Open fire, palea pan burners under the stills, sitting there in shorts. August, I think it was 25 degrees outside and like 40-50 degrees inside in that butchery, sweating, drinking whiskey, having fun. Just kind of a young man's dream going on. And I remember the first drops coming out of the stills. Lasse and I went on the floor, drinking it directly from the still. I can't actually remember how much we knew about methanol at that point. But I'm still here. I can still see.
You can still see everything.
Yeah. So I think that was kind of the beginning of Stauning, starting up in a butchery, and nine very ambitious young men trying to make a copy of a Scotch single malt.
So how did you get from there to where you are now? Because I've not been to your distillery, but I've certainly seen pictures of it, and we've sent out pictures to all of our members who've also seen pictures of these beautiful Scandinavian barn-style buildings with lots and lots of stills inside them, lots of small direct fired stills. So it seems like you've just gone from, back of the house butchery passion project to serious whiskey producer now. Is it been kind of generating the demand for whiskey in Denmark and sort of growing the category out there? Is that what has been the hard work over the years?
Yeah, in 2006 there were not a lot of distilleries in Denmark. Well, aquavit distilleries, yes, but not whiskey. As I remember, the first distillery in Denmark was actually founded in 1940 or 50 something, but only existed for a few years. And then we were one of the first distilleries in 2005-06 to start up. And it kind of kicked off a lot of things going on in the industry. I think probably the major reason to that was actually Mackmyra in Sweden. Them, I think there were a couple of years, or 3, 4, 5 years ahead of us. That started up something in Scandinavia, them actually having a bit of success on making the first whiskey. Then we started up, and people were like, well, I think people were like, it's not possible to make whiskey in Denmark. So everybody was just like, that's a bad idea. Why do that? Why don't you make a bakery instead of making whiskey? And everybody was against us. I think the 9 of us, we are kind of a set of very stubborn guys So the more people say can't be done, the more we wanted it to succeed. And that's I think that's actually a big part of the whiskey industry. That kind of resilience, wanting to perform and actually do. I've learned now. So when we made the first whiskies, and the first was a single malt, and after that we had success with our rye whiskies, and that became like 50-60% of our production actually at rye whiskey, because rye is a big part of Danish culture, rye bread. So it's more natural for us to kind of find our own Scandinavian/Danish style instead of doing a copy of a Scotch whiskey. Somehow I'm like, that's the dumbest thing you can do. You make Glenfarclas, you make great whiskey in Scotland. Why would you try to copy that? So try to make your own style, and we've done that. It got sold out immediately. Every time we did a batch, it got sold out like very, very fast. So I think every third year we found an investment to scale up the business, and just kept on being sold out. Very young whiskey, and I have to, and it's still young whiskey compared to what you just had 10 minutes ago. And we're proud of that. It shows a different style of whiskey. It's more kind of powerful, more vibrant, and it shows the distillery character. And I guess also with Glenfarclas, when you get young Glenfarclas, it will show the distillery character more than in a 15-year-old of whiskey. So for us, it's important to show the distillery character right now. So young whiskeys is what we're about right now. We have older stuff, great stuff also, but for now we're doing young whiskeys. And then we got an extra investment in 2015 that actually enabled us to build that beautiful distillery. And again, we didn't copy the traditional Scotch building style.
No, it doesn't look like a Scotch whiskey distillery at all.
No. We tried to do the Danish kind of Scandinavian style architecture that you see in the pictures today, and we're of course very proud of that distillery. Still, floor malting, 2,500 square meters of floor malting. So all our grain is floor malted, both the rye and the barley. 24 pot stills, and now you said. You talked about direct fire, so 24 direct fired stills, 16 direct fired wash stills, and 8 direct fired spirit stills, 2,000 liter stills. We do around 800,000 liters of alcohol per year at the moment in production. So it's become a large operation, not huge, but a large operation.
I love this sort of combination of like looking at the aesthetic of the building, very modern, though of course sort of based on, I guess, kind of traditional farm barn architecture, but very modern, striking glass and black buildings. And yet all of your practices going on there are super traditional, at least in terms of how whiskey's made in Scotland. And, there's only half a dozen distilleries, maybe it might be one or two more now, doing floor malting in Scotland. Of course, they all used to do it, but slowly kind of shifted out the distilleries. And as we've just talked with Tim, no one doing direct fire exclusively except for Glenfarclas. It literally only just came to me then that we've actually got 2 distilleries on both using direct fire stills only.
Exactly.
It's very unlikely. But yeah, I love this combination of sort of modern and traditional, and then of course the Danish approach to it as well. So maybe do you want to talk just a little bit about the floor malting side of it, because we very rarely have whiskies on here that do their own floor malting, so it might be of interest to our members.
Yeah. Well, doing floor malting is not the easiest thing in the world, and I think if you were to ask any new distillery, they would say no to do that. It would be much easier to buy your malted grain. But as we started like that, it's a huge part of our DNA, and it's also a good way for us to show how to make whiskey. Every time we have a lot of tourists coming to Stauning. I think the best year before COVID, we had around 20,000 guests coming to the distillery, and it enables us to show them how you actually produce whiskey. It's not very often you see that in the whiskey world today, from beginning to end. We have local farmers; they supply the grain to us, to good friends. So you get everything in the distillery from A to C, and the floor malting enabled us to be very not innovative, but testing can test a lot. We can do a lot of different projects. So, for example, currently we're doing now a Christmas tree smoked whiskey. So we've taken a lot of Christmas trees after Christmas, and now we've thrown them in the kiln and burning them and creating a Christmas tree smoked single malt. Yesterday we did our first test on seaweed smoked grain. We're going to do tobacco smoked and hemp smoked. So doing that ourselves, we can really control every part of the process down to small details. That's why we continue doing it, because it's not because it makes a better whiskey. It's a different whiskey, that's for sure, but it's not a better whiskey. So control, I think it's about having control over 100% of the production.
And what about we've got the direct fired stills, and they're all very 2,000 liters sounds like a lot, but that's very small, isn't it? Those are small stills.
Intense, very intense. Small fire, as you say. Get a really full-bodied whiskey, very fruity whiskey. It's alembic stills, so kind of the Arabic style of stills where you try to take all flavors out of that fruit you distill. So you get a lot of fruitiness in our whiskeys. Apple, pear, citrus. We can come back to that, talking about the whiskey. But very different.
And then what about on the cask side of things? What are you doing with barrels?
So in the beginning, we did kind of the traditional stuff. Again, looking to make a copy of a Scotch whiskey, you would do bourbon, you would do sherry, port, these typical styles. And then after some time, we figured out we wanted to create our own style. So we started experimenting a lot, which you can see today. For instance, this is just a weird project. Well, I don't know if you can see this one. You can
make the devil cry.
Or you can make the devil cry. This is just for fun. It's a Tabasco cask. So we've taken a rye whiskey and aged in Tabasco casks. Not that it's going to be our most popular whiskey. I'm quite sure about that, because this is going to kill you. This is so strong. But we've taken all sorts of casks from the whole world. So I think we have 18, 20 different rum casks from all over the world: Australia, Japan, Caribbean islands, South America. We have mezcal, tequila. We have all sorts of sherry types, Amontillado, Palmitado. A lot of distilleries do that. Stout casks, different wines, to actually find out what will fit a Danish profile of spirit more than the traditional style. Again, the goal is not to make a copy of a Scotch, it's to make a Danish spirit, or Danish whiskey. So we've slowly now found out what fits our profile, and we're not done making a Stauning whiskey. We will, like you, 185 years. It's on a constant journey. I think we have a long way to go until we have kind of a Stauning whiskey that's like this. And for some people, it frustrates them. That's not kind of a core style of Stauning. But maybe in 20 years, we'll have that core style of Stauning. We will develop every year going forward. We won't change it like from totally. But if you taste two whiskeys, two batches, they will taste alike. But if you go back 2 years, they will be different, because we are always on a journey to try to explore how we can make our whiskeys better doing different casks.
Yeah, well, it's one of the great benefits of being a new distillery is you have that clear license to do crazy shit and see what works, and it sounds like you're definitely doing that with tobacco and seaweed smoked malt and all these clear casks as well. I mean, it's some interesting combinations there, I expect.
Well, some of this divides people. I think I had a retailer from Germany coming up, and I gave them a sample of a mezcal aged whiskey that is being finished in a pepper stout cask from Mikkeller, Danish beer brand. And I don't actually know how to explain it, but it kind of tastes like going into a zoo at the elephant cage. It has kind of ammonium, kind of really, it's weird stuff going on. And this retail's like, this is no, our customers will not be like to buy this stuff. Then 2 weeks later, I had 2 bartenders. We have a collaboration with the guys from LMC, so Alex Cretina and Luke Wheatley and Matt Wiley. And they came to the distillery and tasted this stuff. And they're like, oh my God, this is insane. Can we buy the cask? So there's something for everybody, I would say, doing experiments like this. Not all of it becomes a limited edition or a core whiskey. Most of it goes into the distillery editions and is being sold at the distillery for tourists coming by. But we have something for everybody as it is right now. We will probably narrow in over the years.
Something for everybody, and everything is for somebody, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Here's a question relating to casks. Will Stauning be doing a pickled herring cask?
I'm not sure. Well, why not? Wait a couple of years, then we'll see.
Well, it's quite an interesting question, actually, because, of course, the alleged story of how barrel charring came about in the first place was that the Reverend Elijah Craig was trying to remove the smell of fish from his barrel before putting his new make whiskey in it. That's one of the legends of it. It may or may not be true, but apparently it was a fishy barrel that he was trying to burn the fish flavor out.
Well, why not? We'll try. Thank you for that advice.
What is the average age of the whiskey? I assume we're talking about Stauning rye here, Stephen.
So so the one you have today is the average of these batches we do on our core rye is between 3 and 4 years. So the average of Stauning whiskies is 3 to 5.5 years. But there's of course exceptions. So 2-3 weeks ago we won as world's best single cask rye whiskey in World Whiskies Awards, and that was a 6-year-old rye whiskey.
Wow.
So we of course also have older stuff, and that is also stuff we're going to release in due time. Things are getting older, but slowly we're going to release some of these older versions. And I think we also have much older stuff. But I think when I taste it, it's actually the 6-7-year-old whiskeys are actually my favorites of all of that. When it gets older, it starts to remind of other rye whiskies out there, American style rye whiskies, and we're actually not that fond of that. So we would like that vibrance and kind of Danish style in a whiskey more than the American style.
Yeah, well, it's always that thing, isn't it, about distillery character and maintaining it. And we've just talked about Glenfarclas 15, which for me is so typical of that distillery. It's 15 years old, and so I guess it comes down to the blending and the maturation, the use of casks on the way. Yeah,
exactly.
Well, another question here about the Danish distilling scene in general, really. You were the first. Are there other whiskey distilleries now in Denmark?
So no, we were actually not the first. There were a very small winery in a small island of Bornholm that did the first cask in 50-60 years or something like that. The first was in the 50s, of course, but now I think there are 19 or 20 whiskey distilleries in Denmark. Small ones, that is. We're probably 4 or 5 of a size where we can live of making whiskey, but most of them does 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 liters per year. So very small craft distilleries. But I think we have 4 or 5 that's over 100,000 liters per year in production.
Yeah, but growing. That's and how's the market for consumption then? I mean, I guess someone's got to be drinking it all. But has Denmark historically been a reasonably good sort of importer of Scotch whiskey and American whiskey? Is there already quite a taste of it, or?
No. Actually, I think I'm 48 years old, and when I were younger, I remember my uncle and people that were drinking whiskey. They were drinking blended whiskey. So Chivas Regal, stuff like that was kind of the prime of whiskey in Denmark. 30 years ago. So about 30 years ago. then, as I remember, Sweden started importing a lot of single malts. That kicked off kind of the single malt wave in Scandinavia, and Danes absorbed that style and started importing single malts from especially Scotland. And now we do a lot of different kinds of whiskies, especially Scotch whiskey. When I look at the Danish whiskey scene, it's actually, sorry to say, a bit boring. It's very traditional. I think we are still 5-10 years behind some of the other European countries in exploring and trying new stuff, and trying different brands also from Scotland, Ireland, new things coming up. People are, kind of, used to drinking that traditional Highland Park, Macallan, stuff, and going back to that. And maybe I don't know if the pricing is too high in Denmark for some of the newer stuff. I'm not sure. But when I go to Sweden or Germany, I see a lot more trying out new stuff and more interest in whiskies.
Yeah. Okay, so let's sort of talk a little bit about Stauning rye then, and maybe do a quick tasting of it. Although I've been sipping away at it continuously.
Yes, I have too.
10 minutes.
Yeah.
Have you been drinking it, Tim?
Yeah, so I was having a look at my bottle. I was part of a whiskey club where we got a bottle, and I think this was it says batch 1-2021. Would that mean it would be 2021?
Yes.
So when you're saying
exactly.
between the years, the batches may be slightly different, I might be slipping on something very different to the rest of it.
You will.
Definitely Stauning rye. It tastes amazing. It smells delicious.
A lot has happened since that time.
How has it developed then since then? What's changed? Is there actually been scaling up in production, I guess, but still using small stills? What else might have changed?
Yeah, so still small stills, but of course when you change your production, as we've done, new stills, bigger stills, only 2,000 liter compared to the 1,000 liter we had in the farm. We had a small distillery in a farm between the butchery and the distillery we have now. Things tend to change, and you all know that when you take in a new still, flavors change, and then you have to work for a long time to kind of tune it in and get back to the flavors you want. But you can't really get exactly back to the flavors you had before. Too much of a change to that. But I think it's only an improvement we've seen over the last years, luckily. We've changed the ratio of rye and barley. In the beginning, we had 70% rye, so 70% malted rye, floor malted rye, and 30% floor malted barley in our mash bill. When we started up the new distillery, we had to go down to 51% rye because it kept on being burnt in the stills. Which might sound really bad. It is bad for the production people because they have several hours of cleaning when you burn your wash in that wash still. It's terrible. And you might know that also from Glenfarclas. I don't know if we have a very full wort. Unclear wort.
With the rye, though, right?
I mean, rye itself is incredibly difficult.
Very sticky.
When you're in the wash, it's very, very different to barley. Do you?
We have wash. Yeah.
We have rummagers, chainmail mesh that go around the bottom of our stills, which are probably slightly bigger. But do you have to do that at all?
No, we've tuned it in so we don't need rummagers, and that was one of the ambitions, not to use that actually. So we had 51%, and we had to tune in our mash tun, really, because there was also a new mash tun, and the problem was in the mash tun. We got too many solids in our wash. So after 6 months, 7 months, we found the recipe, and now we're slowly changing the mash bill again. So now we're about 60% going towards 65, but I think 65% rye is the maximum with the equipment we have today, but also good, very good. So it has changed over the years, the mash bill, and you can taste that also in the whiskey, of course, when you change a ratio like that. But so far only to the better. So it's more full, it's more fruity, a much more complex whiskey. We also had to change the yeast a little bit, going to the new still to kind of go back to some of the flavors. So what you taste is now, again, being from Denmark, I recognize rye bread when I smell and taste this. Freshly baked rye bread, like kind of warm, just coming out of the oven rye bread. We have some warm spices to it. It's not like the American style of rye whiskey where it's super spicy, peppery, licorice. It's more kind of a sweet spice. Yeah. And probably we do a double distillation. We don't do distillation as they do in the US. So it's a completely different way of distilling. And a lot of people say actually it reminds them of single malt whiskey, this rye whiskey. So you can drink it neat. And often people are not very fond of drinking rye whiskey neat in the US because it's too strong, too spicy, too peppery in the flavors. You don't get that in our whiskey.
Yeah. A lot of the American ryes are super spicy, aren't they? I like to drink them with a beer, and the beer kind of like refreshes you. You just, Boilermaker kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's 48% ABV. When you taste it, you get some of these ripe cherries.
There's definitely a berry note on it, like a dark fruit note too. Yeah.
Yes. Licorice also, and again in Denmark, we eat a lot of licorice, way more than other countries, except Finland, I think. But I detect that immediately, the licorice in this.
I love it when this happens, because there's obviously no licorice in the whiskey. No. But this is a whiskey that's made by Danish people who are accustomed to eating licorice and enjoy licorice. And so it's kind of weaved its way into the blending process or the distillation process or some kind of combination of production elements, so that when you bottle it, it tastes a bit like licorice and everyone goes, yeah, that tastes good, because you like licorice.
Yes, exactly. That's true. I'm not sure that you detect licorice the same way as I do in this whiskey. But
I mean, luckily I like licorice, but it's not a flavor that I'm kind of constantly subjected to, like I know that you guys are.
No, exactly. Of course, you get the woody flavors and nose on this because it's aged in a virgin American white oak cask, char 4, so a heavy char. We've then, in the beginning, we only had a virgin American white oak, but now we've started adding other casks into this. So a batch, and as I said earlier, will change over time. So we can have muscatel, we can have port. We've now done some experiments with maple syrup casks. It gives some kind of umami, burnt sugar flavors to it. You don't have it in this one though. So we can start introducing different types of wine, beer, spirits flavors, and vat that into this. So it's not only the virgin American white oak you get, which is super interesting when we do that. One of the last batches of tests we've done is with a Mexican stout, a beer cask from a Danish brewery called 2 Beer. You don't want to put too much of that in there, but a small part of that just enables to get some different, really, some more spicy, kind of earthy flavors into it that I like very much.
Right, hold on a second. Mexican stout cask, did you say? They're making stout beers in Mexico, are they?
I think it's a Danish brew that makes it.
I see. Yeah. Right, okay.
But it fits the mezcal so much, Mexican.
Right, okay. Oh, yeah.
You got some citrus in this, some apple and pear also, some of that fruitiness. And when you taste our new make, that's super fruity. It's not. It's actually not as heavy, probably, as the Glenfarclas as you just mentioned before. It's more like fruity, sweet, and actually very easy to drink. We won some years ago as world's best new make with a peat smoked rye new make. So you get some of this mezcal kind of flavors with apple, pear, and citrus to it. It's actually, I enjoy drinking it. We bottle it and sell it as a bottle called Curious. This stuff good for cocktails. But you get this finish of the vanilla, the woody flavors to it, and also on the nose.
Delightful, so good, and like remarkable for sort of 3 to 4 or 5 years old as well.
Yeah.
We're constantly impressed about what young distilleries can do in a very short space of time at Whiskey Me. As you know, most months these days, and this is sometimes with Scotch whisky distilleries as well. We've done, like I mentioned earlier, a bit of stuff with Glasgow Distillery in the past, and some of the stuff they're putting out at 5 years old is just incredible, I think. So it just goes to show you can do stuff, you can do amazing stuff at that low age statement, just as you can do amazing stuff at 15 years old and 25 years old as well.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. Yeah. It's not to rule something out and say something is not good. You're just widening the, what you can do, what you can drink. I think that's important.
Yeah. Great stuff. All right. Well, the questions have stopped coming, which I think means everyone has passed out by this point. But there's lots of compliments and also 2 contrasting but both exceptional drams this evening. This is what we're aiming for. This is a good month, definitely, where we've got 2 fascinating distilleries for totally different reasons, really, making 2 quite different whiskies as well, but both amazing. So, yeah. Cool. Well, thanks, gents. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Cheers. And thanks, everyone, for listening. And we will see you next time. Cheers.